concrete culvert reeks of sewage and fear as you crouch in darkness, listening to rebel boots thunder overhead while shrapnel burns in your skull. Quick favor, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. This is the moment that would reshape an entire region's destiny, marking the violent end of one of history's most bizarre dictatorships and the beginning of Libya's descent into chaos. The sun rises blood-red over Sirte on October 20th, 2011, casting long shadows across a city that has become Muammar Gaddafi's final fortress. For 42 years, this man has ruled Libya with theatrical brutality, dressing in flowing robes and golden uniforms while crushing dissent beneath his boot. Now, as NATO jets circle overhead like mechanical vultures, the self-proclaimed King of Kings of Africa huddles in District 2, the last loyalist enclave in his hometown, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of his revolution. The morning air carries the acrid smell of burning rubber and cordite. Gaddafi's convoy of 75 vehicles sits ready in the pre-dawn darkness, a desperate gambit to break through rebel lines and reach the sanctuary of Bani Walid, another loyalist stronghold still holding out against the National Transitional Council forces. But this escape plan, conceived in the paranoid mind of a dictator who once pitched Bedouin tents in the gardens of world leaders, is about to collide with 21st century warfare in the most violent way possible. The convoy begins moving at 8:30 local time, a serpentine column of armoured vehicles, pickup trucks mounted with heavy weapons, and luxury sedans carrying the last remnants of Gaddafi's inner circle. His son Mutassim rides in one of the lead vehicles, while the colonel himself, still clinging to the military rank he gave himself decades earlier, travels in an armoured Toyota Land Cruiser near the centre of the formation. The vehicles kick up clouds of desert dust as they race along Highway 1, the main road connecting Sirte to the outside world. What Gaddafi doesn't know is that NATO surveillance drones have been tracking the convoy's movement since before dawn. High above the Libyan desert, invisible to the naked eye, American Predator drones and French aircraft are already moving into attack position. The technology gap between Gaddafi's ground forces and NATO's air power represents more than just military superiority. It symbolises the collision between the colonel's analog-age brutality and the digital precision of modern warfare. The first missiles strike at 8:32 a.m., turning the lead vehicles into twisted metal sculptures. The explosions echo across the desert like thunder, sending shock waves through the remaining convoy as drivers swerve to avoid the burning wreckage of their comrades. NATO pilots, speaking in clinical military jargon over encrypted radio channels, report successful engagement of 11 vehicles. 10 are destroyed or severely damaged within minutes, their occupants either dead or fleeing on foot across the rocky terrain. But which vehicle carried Libya's most wanted man? Chaos erupts as the surviving convoy members abandon their vehicles and scatter into the landscape. Some run toward a cluster of concrete buildings on the outskirts of Sirte. Others dive into drainage ditches that crisscross this part of Libya's coastline. The desert, which has sheltered Bedouin tribes for centuries, now becomes a hunting ground where the most powerful man in Africa is reduced to prey. Gaddafi emerges from his destroyed Land Cruiser with blood streaming down his face, the result of shrapnel wounds that will define his final hours. His trademark flowing robes are torn and dusty, his carefully maintained image of invincibility shattered as completely as his convoy. Beside him, loyal bodyguards help the wounded dictator stumble toward what appears to be salvation. A large concrete drainage culvert, running beneath the highway, designed to channel seasonal floods, but now offering the only cover available in this barren landscape. The irony is suffocating. The man who once declared himself the leader of the revolution now crawls into a sewer pipe like a common criminal. But even as rebel forces close in from all directions, Gaddafi's survival instincts, honed by decades of paranoid rule, keep him alive for a few more precious hours. His guards form a defensive perimeter around the culvert entrance, while the colonel himself disappears into the darkness, his laboured breathing echoing off the concrete walls. Inside this tomb-like cylinder, reeking of stagnant water and human waste, Muammar Gaddafi faces the mathematical certainty of capture. The rebels know exactly where he is. The smoke from burning vehicles provides a perfect beacon, and their communications intercepts have revealed the location of the drainage system. Time, which the dictator has manipulated for over 4 decades through elaborate ceremonies and theatrical displays, has finally run out. The sound of approaching boots grows louder, punctuated by shouts in Arabic, and the metallic clicking of assault rifles being readied. Somewhere in the distance, celebration gunfire erupts, as word spreads through rebel ranks. The tyrant has been found. But what waits at the mouth of this concrete tunnel will transform a military victory into something far more disturbing, setting the stage for Libya's descent into the chaos that continues to this day. As rebel fighters gather at both ends of the culvert, their voices mixing triumph with barely contained rage, one question hangs in the desert air. Will the man who showed no mercy to thousands of his own people receive any mercy in return? The concrete amplifies every sound as rebel boots splash through puddles toward your hiding place, their voices echoing with the fury of men who have waited years for this moment. This isn't just the capture of a dictator. It's the moment when decades of suppressed rage finally find their target, setting in motion events that will haunt Libya for generations. The drainage culvert stretches nearly 50 meters beneath the highway, a concrete tomb that reeks of decay and desperation. Gaddafi crouches in the fetid darkness. His breathing ragged as blood from his head wound drips onto the stagnant water pooling at his feet. The shrapnel embedded in his temple, a fragment from a grenade thrown by one of his own panicked bodyguards during the convoy attack, sends waves of agony through his skull with each heartbeat. Outside, the voices grow closer. These aren't the disciplined soldiers of a regular army, but fighters from Misrata, men whose families were systematically tortured and murdered during Gaddafi's siege of their city. They've traveled 200 kilometers from their devastated homes, specifically to hunt down the man responsible for turning their neighborhoods into killing fields. Their commander, a former teacher named Abdul Hakim Belhaj, has spent months planning this moment, studying maps and coordinating with NATO forces to ensure Gaddafi has no escape route. The colonel's famous golden pistol, a gaudy symbol of his theatrical rule, remains holstered at his side, but his hands shake too violently to draw it. The man who once stood before the United Nations General Assembly and ripped up the charter in a fit of theatrical rage now huddles like a wounded animal, his grandiose speeches about eternal revolution reduced to whispered prayers in the darkness. How does a man who commanded absolute power over 6 million people prepare for the moment when that power evaporates completely? The first rebel appears at the culvert entrance as a silhouette against the blazing October sun. He moves cautiously, assault rifle raised, expecting resistance that never comes. Behind him, more fighters gather, their weapons trained on the dark tunnel where Libya's most wanted fugitive cowers. The contrast couldn't be starker. These young revolutionaries, many barely out of their teens, now hold the fate of a dictator who ruled before they were born. "Come out slowly," one of them shouts in Arabic, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "Keep your hands visible." But Gaddafi doesn't respond immediately, perhaps hoping this is another nightmare that will fade with morning light. The silence stretches until heavy boots begin splashing through the tunnel, their echoes growing louder as the hunters close in on their prey. The moment of contact occurs 30 meters from the entrance. A flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating Gaddafi's face, bloodied, bewildered, and utterly defeated. The man who once claimed to be the rightful ruler of the entire African continent now blinks like a mole exposed to sunlight, his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. The transformation is so complete that some fighters initially doubt they've found the right man, but there's no mistaking those distinctive features, made famous by 4 decades of propaganda posters and television appearances. The aquiline nose, the deep-set eyes that once burned with megalomaniacal fire, now dulled by pain and terror. Even his trademark curly hair, usually perfectly styled, hangs in matted clumps around his wounded head. The extraction from the culvert becomes a scene of barely controlled chaos. Hands grab at Gaddafi's torn robes, hauling him through the concrete tunnel as he stumbles and falls repeatedly. His legs, weakened by age and trauma, can barely support his weight. The rebels drag him toward the mouth of the culvert, like hunters emerging with their prize, their shouts of victory echoing off the concrete walls. But what emerges into the desert sunlight isn't the triumphal capture of a war criminal, it's the beginning of something far darker. The moment Gaddafi's bloodied face appears at the tunnel entrance, dozens of cell phone cameras begin recording, capturing images that will circle the globe within hours. The man who controlled Libya's media apparatus for decades now becomes the unwilling star of the most viewed execution footage in internet history. What happens when a crowd discovers they have absolute power over the person they hate most in the world? The temperature outside the culvert hovers near 35 degrees Celsius, but Gaddafi shivers uncontrollably as hands pull him upright. His expensive watch, a Rolex given to him by an Italian arms dealer, catches the sunlight as he tries to shield his face from the cameras. Blood continues to flow from his head wound, staining his golden brown shirt and dripping onto the rocky ground where other men's blood has already soaked into the earth. More fighters arrive by the minute, drawn by radio reports and the growing crowd around the drainage entrance. Many carry smartphones, documenting every moment of their victory over the man who turned their country into a police state. But their celebration carries an undercurrent of something more primitive, the desire for immediate justice against someone who showed no mercy to their families and friends. The crowd begins to form a rough circle around their captive, creating a human arena in the middle of the Libyan desert. Gaddafi, supported by two rebels who grip his arms, sways unsteadily as he tries to comprehend his situation. His lips move silently, perhaps repeating verses from the Quran, or simply mumbling incoherently from shock and blood loss. Someone shouts, "Keep him alive." The voice carries authority, possibly from a field commander who understands the political importance of bringing Gaddafi to trial. But other voices respond with curses and threats, the crowd's mood shifting like a sandstorm building on the horizon. The question of whether Libya's revolution will end with justice or vengeance hangs in the superheated desert air, awaiting an answer that will define the country's future. In this moment, suspended between capture and whatever comes next, Muammar Gaddafi faces the arithmetic of revolution and discovers that 42 years of absolute power can vanish in less than 42 seconds. The golden pistol gleams at Gaddafi's waist as rough hands drag him toward a pickup truck, but his trembling fingers can't reach the weapon that once symbolized his absolute authority. This is the moment when theoretical justice collides with primal vengeance, transforming a military victory into a scene that will define Libya's post-revolutionary identity. The crowd around Gaddafi swells to nearly 50 fighters as word spreads through rebel radio networks. Each arrival brings fresh energy to the chaotic scene, men who have traveled hundreds of kilometers specifically to witness this moment. Many carry pictures of dead relatives, fathers killed in Abu Salim prison, brothers who disappeared during the early days of the uprising, children killed by Gaddafi's artillery during the siege of Misrata. These aren't abstract freedom fighters, but men driven by intensely personal grievances. The pickup truck, a white Toyota Hilux with its bed converted into a makeshift transport, represents the next stage in Gaddafi's journey from absolute ruler to captive. But getting him into the vehicle becomes an exercise in controlled chaos, as dozens of hands grab at his clothing, each fighter wanting physical contact with their former tormentor. His golden shirt tears at the shoulders as multiple people pull in different directions, the expensive fabric reduced to rags within minutes. Someone produces a length of rope, and Gaddafi's hands are bound behind his back with practiced efficiency. The knots are tight enough to cut off circulation, turning his fingers purple within minutes. His breathing becomes more labored as the crowd presses closer, their combined body heat raising the temperature around the truck to nearly unbearable levels. The smell of sweat, cordite, and blood creates a suffocating atmosphere that makes several fighters step back to catch their breath. But what transforms this capture from a military operation into something more disturbing is the gradual breakdown of command structure among the rebels. The initial shouts of, "Keep him alive," give way to more violent suggestions as fighters recall specific atrocities committed by Gaddafi's forces. Someone mentions the rape squads that terrorized Benghazi. Another describes finding mass graves outside Tripoli. Each story raises the crowd's temperature, turning what began as a professional military operation into something resembling a lynch mob. Gaddafi himself seems to understand the shift in mood. His earlier attempts to speak, mumbled pleas in Arabic that few could hear over the crowd noise, cease entirely as he recognizes the futility of appealing for mercy from men who received none during his rule. Instead, he focuses on simply breathing, each inhalation a conscious effort, as the crowd's energy becomes increasingly threatening. The bed of the pickup truck sits about 4 feet off the ground, requiring Gaddafi to be lifted by multiple hands. But this isn't a gentle assistance. Fighters grab whatever part of his body they can reach, hauling him upward with no regard for his injuries or dignity. His head wound, still bleeding freely, leaves crimson smears on the truck's white paint as he's dragged over the tailgate. Once in the truck bed, Gaddafi finds himself surrounded by 8 armed men, their weapons pointed inward in a rough circle. The space is cramped, forcing everyone into intimate proximity that amplifies the tension. Several fighters produce cell phones, recording close-up footage of the deposed dictator's face as he struggles to remain conscious. The images they capture, bloodied, disoriented, utterly defeated, will become some of the most widely distributed content in social media history. The truck engine starts with a diesel roar that drowns out conversation for a moment, but as the vehicle begins moving, bouncing over rough terrain toward the main highway, The relative quiet allows for more focused interactions between captors and captive. Someone asks Gaddafi about specific atrocities, their voice tight with barely controlled rage. When he doesn't respond immediately, a rifle butt strikes his shoulder, producing a grunt of pain that the cell phone cameras eagerly record. What happens when absolute power encounters absolute powerlessness in the back of a moving truck? The journey towards Sirte takes on an increasingly surreal quality as the truck bed becomes a mobile interrogation chamber. Fighters take turns questioning Gaddafi about different aspects of his rule, but his responses, when they come at all, are increasingly incoherent. The combination of blood loss, shock, and what appears to be a concussion leaves him drifting in and out of awareness, his head lolling against the truck's side panels as they bounce over potholes. But it's the gradual escalation of physical abuse that transforms this transport into something darker. What begins as rough handling evolves into deliberate violence as individual fighters act on personal grievances. A knife appears, a standard military blade that catches the sunlight as it moves toward Gaddafi's body. The exact sequence of events becomes difficult to track, as multiple camera angles capture different perspectives of the same horrific moments. The sound that emerges from Gaddafi's throat when the blade makes contact isn't quite a scream, more like the noise a wounded animal makes when it has no energy left for protest. His body convulses, then goes rigid, then relaxes, in a way that suggests something fundamental has changed. The men around him exchange glances, some satisfied, others appearing shocked by what they've just witnessed or participated in. Blood pools in the truck bed, mixing with dust and diesel fumes to create a smell that several fighters will later describe in interviews as unforgettable. The white Toyota's paint job, already stained from Gaddafi's head wound, becomes a canvas of evidence that will later complicate official narratives about his death. But in this moment, surrounded by armed men drunk on revolutionary victory, such concerns about future investigations seem impossibly distant. The truck continues its journey towards Sirte as the sun reaches its zenith, casting harsh shadows that make the scene in the vehicle bed appear even more nightmarish through the grainy cell phone footage. And somewhere in that bouncing, blood-soaked space, the line between justice and vengeance disappears completely, setting the stage for Libya's transformation from revolution to chaos. The concrete floor of the meat locker feels like ice against your skin, as fluorescent lights flicker overhead, illuminating your lifeless form alongside your son's body in a grotesque family reunion. This macabre display will become the most controversial aspect of Libya's revolution, transforming a military victory into a public spectacle that haunts the country's transition to democracy. The industrial freezer in Misrata sits in a nondescript warehouse district, its purpose normally reserved for storing beef and lamb for the city's restaurants. But on October 21st, 2011, it becomes an impromptu morgue for Libya's most infamous father and son. The facility's owner, a middle-aged businessman named Ahmed Belkacem, never imagined his commercial refrigeration unit would become a pilgrimage site for thousands of Libyans seeking confirmation that their nightmare has finally ended. The bodies arrive separately, Gaddafi's corpse transported in the same blood-stained Toyota that carried him from the drainage culvert, while Mutassim's remains follow in a military ambulance, his chest bearing the small puncture wounds that match the shrapnel visible in earlier capture footage. Both men wear the same clothes from their final morning, expensive shirts now torn and stained with blood that has darkened to the colour of rust in the desert heat. Dr. Ibrahim Tika, the pathologist summoned to examine the bodies, arrives at the warehouse still wearing his hospital scrubs from an emergency surgery. He's treated gunshot victims throughout the 8-month civil war, but nothing has prepared him for the political weight of this particular examination. Every measurement he takes, every wound he catalogues, will be scrutinised by international observers seeking to understand exactly how Libya's dictator died. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Gaddafi's face, emphasising the damage inflicted during his final hours. The shrapnel wound near his temple has stopped bleeding, creating a dark crater surrounded by swollen tissue. But it's the gunshot wound to his head that draws Tika's immediate attention, a neat entry hole behind the left ear that suggests close-range execution rather than combat injury. What kind of bullet travels through a dictator's brain while international cameras capture every moment? Tika's preliminary findings paint a disturbing picture of Gaddafi's final moments. The abdominal wound, a through-and-through gunshot that perforated his intestines, would have been survivable with immediate medical attention. But the headshot, fired from less than 3 feet away, caused massive trauma to his brainstem, ensuring death within seconds. The trajectory suggests the shooter was standing directly behind the kneeling or prone dictator, execution style, But the most disturbing evidence emerges during the detailed examination of both bodies. Mutassim's corpse shows signs of prolonged torture, cigarette burns on his chest, rope marks around his wrists, and defensive wounds on his hands suggesting he fought desperately against his captors. The video footage of him smoking calmly just hours before his death takes on a more sinister meaning when viewed alongside these physical findings. The warehouse becomes a crime scene that no one wants to investigate officially. Representatives from the National Transitional Council arrive to view the bodies, but their focus remains on political damage control rather than forensic accuracy. The international community demands answers, but Libya's new leaders find themselves trapped between satisfying global opinion and appeasing the fighters who delivered their victory. Queues begin forming outside the warehouse by mid-morning on October 22nd, stretching for several blocks through Misrata's war-damaged streets. Families who lost relatives to Gaddafi's security forces wait patiently for their chance to see the bodies, treating the freezer like a shrine where they can finally achieve closure. Many bring cameras, creating an endless stream of selfies with corpses that will circulate on social media for years. The viewing process becomes increasingly macabre as the day progresses. Warehouse workers, overwhelmed by the crowds, begin charging admission fees. 5 dinars per person to enter the freezer, 10 dinars for photographs. Children as young as 8 are lifted by their parents to peer over the metal tables where the bodies lie, their innocent faces reflecting the complex mixture of satisfaction and revulsion that characterizes Libya's collective response to their former leader's death. But it's the international reaction that transforms this local spectacle into a global controversy. Amateur video footage, shot on smartphones and uploaded to YouTube within hours, shows graphic close-ups of both bodies in various stages of decay. The images violate every principle of human dignity, while providing undeniable proof that Gaddafi's reign has ended permanently. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls the display disgusting, while United Nations officials demand immediate investigation into the circumstances of both deaths. Hillary Clinton's infamous comment, "We came, we saw, he died," becomes a rallying cry for critics who argue that NATO's intervention enabled extrajudicial killing rather than promoting rule of law. How do you maintain international legitimacy when your revolution's trophy is a rotting corpse in a meat locker? The smell becomes unbearable by the third day despite the industrial refrigeration. Human decomposition produces gases that even commercial freezers can't entirely suppress, forcing warehouse workers to install additional ventilation fans and burn incense continuously. Visitors begin covering their faces with scarves soaked in perfume, but many still vomit from the combination of visual horror and olfactory assault. Dr. Othman al-Zintani, the forensic pathologist officially assigned to conduct Gaddafi's autopsy, arrives on October 23rd with a team of international observers. His examination, performed under harsh warehouse lighting, with dozens of spectators pressed against police barriers, reveals the full extent of violence inflicted on both father and son. The official cause of death, gunshot wound to the head, barely captures the brutality documented in al-Zintani's private notes. But the autopsy report itself becomes another source of controversy when Libyan authorities refuse to release the complete findings. Key details about wound patterns, time of death, and evidence of torture disappear into classified files that will remain sealed for years. The public receives only sanitized summaries that raise more questions than they answer about the final hours of Libya's most hated family. The body's removal from public display on October 25th creates its own drama as crowds surge forward for final photographs. Some visitors attempt to touch the corpses, believing contact with their former oppressor will bring good luck or healing. Others spit on the remains or shout curses that echo through the warehouse's concrete space, releasing decades of suppressed rage in a cathartic explosion of collective hatred. As refrigerated trucks arrive to transport the bodies to their secret burial site in the desert, the warehouse returns to its normal function of storing meat for Misrata's restaurants. But the stains on the concrete floor and the lingering smell in the air serve as permanent reminders of the 3 days when Libya's revolution revealed its darkest impulses to the world. The desert sand swirls around the unmarked gravesite as bulldozers work under cover of darkness, erasing the final evidence of a dynasty that once controlled Africa's largest oil reserves. This secret burial marks the beginning of Libya's institutional collapse, as the country's new leaders discover that destroying a dictator is far easier than building a democracy. The burial site lies approximately 30 kilometers southeast of Misrata, in a patch of barren desert, chosen specifically for its isolation from major roads and population centers. At 3 a.m. on October 25th, a convoy of military vehicles arrives carrying the refrigerated remains of Muammar and Muammar Gaddafi, along with a small team of gravediggers sworn to absolute secrecy about the location. The operation unfolds with military precision despite its macabre nature. Portable floodlights illuminate a rectangular pit hastily excavated by bulldozers, while armed guards establish a security perimeter to prevent unauthorized witnesses. The bodies, wrapped in simple white shrouds according to Islamic tradition, are lowered into the ground without ceremony or prayer, a stark contrast to the elaborate funeral Gaddafi had planned for himself during his years in power. Abdul Rahman al-Ghali, one of the National Transitional Council officials overseeing the burial, later describes the scene as necessary but unsatisfying. The lack of religious ritual troubles many of the participants, devout Muslims who believe even their worst enemies deserve proper funeral rites. But political considerations override religious obligations. Any marked grave would become either a pilgrimage site for Gaddafi loyalists or a target for continued desecration by his enemies. The bulldozers work for hours after the burial, moving tons of sand and rocks to obscure any trace of the gravesite. Global positioning system coordinates are recorded by military officials but kept classified at the highest levels of government. Even the drivers of the burial vehicles are blindfolded during the return journey to prevent them from identifying the location later. But what haunts Libya more than the secret burial is the power vacuum Gaddafi's death creates throughout the country's fractured tribal structure. Within hours of the official announcement of his death, competing militias begin claiming credit for the killing, each seeking to leverage their role in his capture into political influence. The Misrata fighters who controlled his final hours demand key positions in Libya's new government. Zintan militias, who had secured other high-value targets, assert their own claims to power. Meanwhile, tribal leaders from across the country arrive in Tripoli, expecting rewards for their support during the revolution. The National Transitional Council, led by Chairman Mustafa Abdul Jalil, finds itself managing a coalition that exists only because of shared hatred for Gaddafi. With their common enemy eliminated, the fundamental disagreements about Libya's future, secular versus religious government, centralized versus federal structure, the role of tribal authority, explode into open conflict within weeks of the dictator's death. Benghazi, the birthplace of the revolution, celebrates with gunfire that echoes through the night for 3 consecutive days. But even in the midst of jubilation, underlying tensions between eastern and western Libya reassert themselves. Eastern leaders, who initiated the uprising against Gaddafi, expect dominant roles in the new government. Western militias, who delivered the decisive victory in Tripoli, demand equal representation. The compromise solutions satisfy no one completely. The international community's response reveals the complex geopolitical calculations behind Libya's revolution. NATO officials meeting in Brussels declare Operation Unified Protector a complete success while privately acknowledging concerns about the manner of Gaddafi's death. French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who had pushed hardest for military intervention, finds himself defending the operation against critics, who argue that regime change was never authorized by United Nations Resolution 1973. But it's the reaction from Libya's neighbors that proves most prescient about the country's future instability. Egyptian officials express private concerns about weapons flowing across their western border as various militias refuse to disarm. Tunisian authorities begin reinforcing their frontier posts as reports emerge of former Gaddafi loyalists seeking refuge across international boundaries. Algeria, which had maintained careful neutrality during the civil war, quietly increases military patrols along its Libyan frontier. How does a country with no democratic institutions transition from dictatorship to governance when the only unifying factor was opposition to one man? The celebration in Martyrs Square, formerly Green Square during Gaddafi's rule, attracts tens of thousands of Libyans seeking cathartic release after 8 months of civil war. But careful observers note the distinct groupings within the crowd, with fighters from different cities clustering around their own banners rather than mixing freely. The unity appears genuine but fragile, dependent on continued euphoria that will inevitably fade as practical governance challenges emerge. Libya's oil industry, which provided over 90% of government revenue during Gaddafi's era, faces immediate challenges as various militias seize control of different production facilities. The National Oil Corporation, based in Tripoli, issues optimistic statements about resuming full production within months. But field engineers report that many installations require extensive repairs after months of fighting, while security concerns prevent international companies from returning their personnel to Libya. The discovery of Gaddafi's hidden assets creates another source of conflict among Libya's new leaders. Swiss bank accounts, London real estate investments, and gold reserves scattered across multiple countries represent billions of dollars that could fund reconstruction efforts. But accessing these frozen assets requires international legal processes that move slowly while Libya's immediate needs grow increasingly urgent. Perhaps most troubling for Libya's future is the complete absence of state institutions capable of managing the transition. Gaddafi had deliberately weakened every government ministry, ensuring that all significant decisions flowed through his personal network of advisors and family members. The police force, intelligence services, and military command structure disintegrated during the revolution, leaving a security vacuum that militias rushed to fill with their own informal authority. The euphoria surrounding Gaddafi's death masks these fundamental challenges for several weeks, but the underlying problems prove impossible to ignore as winter approaches. Power outages plague major cities as electrical infrastructure damaged during the fighting awaits repair. Medical supplies run short in hospitals overwhelmed by wounded civilians and fighters. Schools remain closed in many areas where buildings sustained combat damage or continue to serve as militia headquarters. International observers, arriving in increasing numbers to assess Libya's needs, file reports that paint a sobering picture beneath the surface celebration. The country possesses tremendous natural wealth and a relatively educated population, but lacks every institutional foundation necessary for democratic governance. The revolution succeeded in removing a dictator, but failed to create any coherent plan for what would replace his 42-year reign. As November 2011 approaches, the deadline NATO has set for ending military operations, Libya faces the paradox of victorious revolution. Having achieved their primary objective of removing Gaddafi, the country's various factions must now confront the far more difficult task of building something better in his place. The secret grave in the desert becomes a metaphor for Libya's future, buried so deeply that even those who created it struggle to locate it again, while the consequences of what lies beneath continue to shape everything above ground. The golden pistol sits in an evidence locker in Misrata, as Libya's new government struggles to explain how their revolution's greatest trophy became the catalyst for a decade of civil war. This single weapon, plucked from Gaddafi's holster during his final moments, will become a symbol of everything that went wrong in post-revolutionary Libya, the triumph of militia law over institutional justice. The pistol itself tells a story of Gaddafi's grandiose self-image carried to its logical extreme. Custom manufactured in Belgium, the weapon features gold-plated surfaces engraved with verses from the Quran, alongside Gaddafi's personal motto, "The people's authority is eternal." The grip bears his initials in ornate Arabic calligraphy, while the barrel displays a miniature map of Africa with Libya prominently highlighted. Even his sidearm served as propaganda, transforming a tool of violence into a statement about divine destiny and continental leadership. But the gun's capture reveals the chaotic nature of Libya's revolutionary forces more clearly than any official report. At least 6 different fighters claim to have personally removed the weapon from Gaddafi's body, each offering conflicting accounts of the circumstances. Mohammed al-Bibi, a 19-year-old from Misrata, insists he grabbed the pistol while Gaddafi was still breathing. Salim Bakir, a veteran of the siege of Sirte, maintains he took it from the dictator's corpse in the truck bed. The competing narratives reflect the absence of command structure that plagued Libya's revolution from its earliest days. The weapon becomes a political football as various militia commanders attempt to claim ownership. The Misrata Military Council argues that since their fighters captured Gaddafi, the pistol rightfully belongs in their city's war museum. Tripoli-based officials counter that such an important artifact should reside in the national capital. Meanwhile, tribal leaders from Gaddafi's home region quietly suggest the gun should be buried with its owner. According to traditional customs, what happens when a nation's most important piece of evidence disappears into the same chaos that created it? The pistol's journey through post-revolutionary Libya mirrors the country's descent into institutional collapse. Initially secured by Misrata authorities, the weapon changes hands multiple times as different factions seize control of government buildings. By early 2012, nobody can definitively say where the golden gun is located, though rumors place it everywhere from a Benghazi militia headquarters to a private collector in Dubai. More troubling than the pistol's disappearance is what it represents about Libya's inability to establish legitimate authority after Gaddafi's death. The National Transitional Council, supposedly the country's interim government, lacks the basic power to control a single piece of evidence, let alone manage a country with over 200 armed militias. Each group operates according to its own interpretation of revolutionary justice, creating a patchwork of competing authorities that paralyze effective governance. The broader implications become clear as Libya's security situation deteriorates throughout 2012. The same militia fighters who celebrated Gaddafi's death in Martyrs Square now battle each other for control of Tripoli's airports, oil terminals, and government buildings. The revolution that began with demands for democracy evolves into a struggle between regional power centers, each claiming legitimacy based on their role in overthrowing the dictator. International efforts to trace the Golden Pistol reflect growing concern about weapons proliferation throughout the region. NATO officials estimate that over 20,000 shoulder-fired missiles disappeared from Gaddafi's arsenals during the revolution, while small arms flow freely across Libya's porous borders. The pistol becomes a symbol of this larger chaos, a single weapon whose location nobody can determine in a country awash with military hardware. The investigation into Gaddafi's death, promised by the National Transitional Council in the immediate aftermath of his killing, stalls completely by mid-2012. The commission established to examine the circumstances of his capture and execution never releases a public report, with officials citing security concerns and the sensitivity of ongoing political negotiations. Key witnesses refuse to cooperate, claiming they fear retaliation from rival militias. But it's the Human Rights Watch report, released in October 2012, that provides the most damning assessment of what really happened during Gaddafi's final hours. Based on extensive interviews with fighters present at the capture site, the organization documents systematic torture, execution-style killings, and deliberate efforts to prevent medical treatment that might have saved the dictator's life. How do you investigate war crimes when the witnesses are now the country's de facto government? The 53 bodies discovered at the Mahari Hotel in Sirte on October 24th represent the broader pattern of extrajudicial killings that accompanied Gaddafi's death. All appear to be former regime loyalists, executed at close range during the final hours of the city's siege. The mass killing occurs within 24 hours of the dictator's capture, suggesting coordination between different rebel units rather than spontaneous acts of vengeance. These executions, documented through ballistic evidence and witness testimony, paint a disturbing picture of revolutionary justice that prioritizes elimination of enemies over legal accountability. The fighters responsible for these killings later assume positions of authority in Libya's new security apparatus, ensuring that investigations into their actions remain perpetually stalled. The international community's muted response to evidence of extrajudicial killings reflects the complex political calculations surrounding Libya's transition. European officials, having invested considerable political capital in the NATO intervention, avoid highlighting aspects of the revolution that might undermine public support for their actions. American diplomats focus on securing Libya's chemical weapons stockpiles, rather than pursuing accountability for human rights violations. Meanwhile, the Golden Pistol continues its underground journey through Libya's black market networks. BBC reporters, attempting to trace the weapon in 2016, discover it briefly appeared in a Benghazi arms dealer's inventory before disappearing again into private collections. The gun's monetary value, estimated at over $50,000 due to its historical significance, ensures continued interest from collectors willing to ignore its provenance. The pistol's story intersects with Libya's broader narrative of institutional failure as the country splits into competing governments by 2014. The internationally recognized administration in Tobruk controls eastern Libya, while a rival government in Tripoli dominates the western regions. Neither authority can effectively investigate Gaddafi's death or locate the evidence from his killing, as both depend on militia support that makes such investigations politically impossible. Perhaps most ironically, the Golden Gun becomes more famous in death than it ever was during Gaddafi's lifetime. Social media posts featuring grainy photographs of the weapon generate thousands of shares, while online forums debate its current location with the intensity of treasure hunters. The pistol achieves the kind of global recognition that Gaddafi always craved for Libya itself, but as a symbol of chaos rather than revolutionary success. By 2020, as Libya enters its second decade of civil war, the Golden Pistol serves as a perfect metaphor for the country's squandered potential. Somewhere in the labyrinth of militia warehouses, private collections, or black market networks, Gaddafi's final possession continues to change hands among men who profit from the very instability his death was supposed to end. The weapon that once symbolized absolute power now represents the complete absence of legitimate authority in a country where revolution succeeded too well, destroying not just a dictator, but the very possibility of the stable government that was supposed to replace him. The television screens flicker in Damascus and Tehran as foreign powers calculate how to fill the vacuum left by a dictator whose death triggered the very chaos they now exploit. This is the moment when Libya's revolution transforms from a national uprising into a proxy battlefield where regional powers pursue their own interests through local militias, armed with Gaddafi's abandoned weapons. The geopolitical reverberations of October 20th, 2011 extend far beyond Libya's borders, reshaping alliance structures across North Africa and the Middle East. Within weeks of Gaddafi's death, intelligence services from at least 6 countries begin establishing networks inside Libya, each seeking to influence the country's future direction through carefully selected local partners. Turkey's ruling Justice and Development Party sees Libya as a crucial testing ground for their model of political Islam, funneling support to militias affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkish intelligence operatives, working through humanitarian aid organizations, begin shipping weapons and military advisors to Tripoli-based factions. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan publicly celebrates Gaddafi's death, while privately instructing his foreign ministry to establish a permanent foothold in Libya's emerging power structure. Egypt's military establishment, led by Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, views developments in Libya with growing alarm. The prospect of an Islamist government controlling Libya's eastern border threatens Egypt's own stability during the Arab Spring upheaval. Egyptian intelligence begins supporting secular militias in eastern Libya, particularly those led by former Gaddafi military officers who share the Egyptian army's suspicion of religious political movements. But it's the involvement of Gulf states that transforms Libya's post-revolutionary landscape most dramatically. The United Arab Emirates, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, commits billions of dollars to preventing Muslim Brotherhood influence from spreading westward from Egypt. Emirati cargo planes, operating from bases in Jordan and Sudan, begin regular flights to eastern Libya, carrying sophisticated weapon systems that tip the balance in favor of secular militias. How does a country's civil war become a continental chess match where Libyan blood pays for foreign ambitions? Qatar's emir, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, pursues the opposite strategy, viewing Libya as an opportunity to expand Qatari influence through Islamist networks. Qatari military aircraft, which had participated in NATO operations during the revolution, continue flying missions into Libya long after the official end of Operation Unified Protector. These flights carry weapons, communications equipment, and financial support to Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated militias in western Libya. The competition between UAE and Qatari proxies creates a shadow conflict that mirrors broader regional tensions. Libyan militias become extensions of foreign intelligence services, their weapons and salaries provided by governments whose ultimate objectives have little to do with Libyan democracy. The revolution that began with demands for self-determination evolves into a struggle between external powers using Libya as a battlefield for their regional rivalry. France's role becomes particularly complex as President Sarkozy faces domestic investigations into allegations that his 2007 presidential campaign received illegal funding from Gaddafi's government. The urgency with which French forces participated in the NATO intervention may have reflected not just humanitarian concerns, but also a desire to eliminate a witness to potential corruption. French intelligence services maintain extensive networks inside Libya after Gaddafi's death, officially focused on counter-terrorism, but actually pursuing evidence related to their former president's legal troubles. Russian President Vladimir Putin's reaction to the NATO intervention and Gaddafi's death shapes Moscow's approach to subsequent conflicts throughout the Middle East. Putin views the Libya operation as evidence that Western powers will use humanitarian justifications to pursue regime change against any government they oppose. This perception directly influences Russian policy during the Syrian civil war, where Moscow provides military support to Bashar al-Assad, partly to prevent another Libya-style intervention. The emergence of the Islamic State in Libya during 2014 represents the most dramatic consequence of the post-Gaddafi power vacuum. ISIS fighters, many veterans of conflicts in Iraq and Syria, exploit the absence of effective government to establish strongholds along Libya's Mediterranean coast. The port city of Sirte, site of Gaddafi's final stand, becomes the Islamic State's primary North African headquarters, a bitter irony that underscores Libya's transformation from dictatorship to failed state. European Union officials meeting in Brussels during late 2014 confront the reality that their intervention to protect Libyan civilians has created a migration crisis that threatens European political stability. The The collapse of Libya's border controls allows hundreds of thousands of migrants from across sub-Saharan Africa to attempt dangerous Mediterranean crossings. The human smuggling networks that emerge from Libya's chaos generate billions in revenue while causing thousands of deaths at sea. But what makes Libya's trajectory particularly tragic is how predictable much of the chaos becomes in retrospect. Intelligence assessments from 2011, classified at the time but later leaked, warned that Gaddafi's removal without a detailed post-conflict plan would likely result in state collapse and regional instability. These warnings were largely ignored by political leaders focused on the immediate goal of ending the dictator's reign. The oil industry, which represented Libya's primary source of revenue and potential foundation for post-revolutionary stability, becomes another casualty of the country's fragmentation. By 2016, Libya's oil production has fallen to less than 25% of pre-revolution levels as militias seize control of different facilities. The National Oil Corporation splits into competing entities, each claiming legitimacy while lacking effective control over production or revenue distribution. International efforts to reunify Libya through diplomatic negotiations produce a series of agreements that exist primarily on paper. The Sirte Agreement of 2015 creates a government of national accord, led by Fayez al-Sarraj. But this internationally recognized authority controls little territory beyond central Tripoli. Rival administrations in eastern Libya and southern regions ignore the agreement while continuing to receive support from their foreign backers. The human cost of Libya's post-revolutionary chaos becomes staggering as accurate casualty figures become impossible to compile. The United Nations estimates that over 15,000 people have died in fighting since Gaddafi's death, while hundreds of thousands have been displaced internally or fled to neighboring countries. These numbers likely represent significant undercounts given the breakdown of government record-keeping and the remote locations of many conflicts. Perhaps most tragically, Libya's descent into chaos validates some of Gaddafi's propaganda about the consequences of challenging his rule. The dictator had repeatedly warned that his removal would result in civil war and foreign intervention, the predictions that his supporters cite as evidence of his strategic wisdom. This narrative complicates efforts to build democratic institutions by suggesting that authoritarian stability might be preferable to chaotic freedom. The international community's response to Libya's collapse reveals the limitations of humanitarian intervention without comprehensive post-conflict planning. NATO's military success in removing Gaddafi contrasts sharply with the alliance's failure to prevent the humanitarian catastrophe that followed. Libya becomes a cautionary tale cited by opponents of military intervention in subsequent conflicts, contributing to Western reluctance to act decisively in Syria and other humanitarian crises. By 2024, 13 years after Gaddafi's death in that drainage culvert outside Sirte, Libya remains divided between competing governments while foreign powers continue pursuing their objectives through local proxies. The revolution that promised to liberate Libyan people from dictatorship has trapped them in a different kind of prison, one built from the competing ambitions of regional powers who view Libya as a strategic asset rather than a sovereign nation, deserving of stability and self-determination.